It's an honor to be with you. So I've been asked to share this many times, and it's not on my dissertation topic, as I've mentioned. And so as a result of that, it is not as polished of a presentation as I wish it was. And so I do apologize for that. It's really sort of a conglomeration of a paper that I have given at a few academic conferences early on. It began when I came across thousands of pages of declassified FBI files relating to Seventh-day Adventism in World War I. And this came actually when I was doing my comprehensive exam preparation, which is the worst time to come up with a big discovery like this. And so it was very distracting. But as soon as I finished my comps, I turned this into a paper because I thought it was too significant to ignore. And so what we still have is some of my early thoughts on these issues. And it's something that will be explored in further depth as time goes on. But let's set the stage here for you a little bit. So in 1908, the Bureau of Investigation, which I may call just the BI, and this was, of course, renamed the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1935. In 1908, it was established under the jurisdiction of the Department of Justice. And then during World War I, the Bureau became heavily involved in surveilling religion. So it kind of starts out as a small organization, and World War I really put the FBI on the map. And at present, historians have only studied two denominations in this period regarding state surveillance, and that's the Church of God in Christ, which is a Black Pentecostal religion, and the International Bible Students, or Russellites, who take the name Jehovah's Witnesses later. But many other religious bodies were surveilled during the First World War to greater or lesser degrees. And so I'm going to share with you about the BI's surveillance of Seventh-day Adventism between 1915 and 1918, which is primarily narrated through these thousands of pages of declassified files I just mentioned to you before. And so the BI, what I have found is the BI intentionally targeted Seventh-day Adventism during World War I through the surveillance of every aspect of the church, its members, ministers, and colporteurs, church and school communities, sanitariums, and publishing houses. During the first 6 months of the war alone, the, quote, Department of Justice, and this is from a Seventh-day Adventist administrator, the Department of Justice received over 10,000 complaints against Seventh-day Adventists, their published literature, and their work. And the BI's, their motto, their investigation typically began with citizens' complaints. And according to the historian Theodore Cornweibel Jr., it was the BI's policy to investigate everything. And so the state was suspicious of Seventh-day Adventism for a variety of reasons, including their sympathy toward labor unions, non-combatant position toward the war, apparent lack of patriotism, their Christian anarchistic doctrine of the two-horned beast, the international constituency, and its organizational structure, particularly the European sector. This paper initiates exploration into the Adventist response to state surveillance, specifically looking at censorship demands and the state directive to reorganize the denominational structure. The state had begun to surveil Adventism by at least the summer of 1915, more than a year and a half before the United States declared war on Germany in April 1917, and it continued for several years after the war concluded in November 1918. Adventist individuals, communities, and institutions experienced focused harassment and oppression from the investigative arms of the state, which included the agents from the Department of Justice and Bureau of Investigation, the Military Intelligence Division of the War Department, the Post Office, the Department of Agriculture, the Red Cross, the YMCA, state departments, the American Protective League, which is basically a group of unofficial thugs that worked to sort of spy on behalf of the government. And then, of course, there were numerous anti-Adventist loyal American citizens throughout the nation who were happy to report on cultish Adventist activity that was un-American. Well, these entities wielded the law by the authority of presidential executive orders and a variety of acts. Most notably, these included the espionage, sedition, and man and trading with enemy acts, and all of these were passed by Congress. Yet, as Cornweibel has noted, quote, these acts' vagueness permitted federal prosecutors who were often responding to political pressure to define disloyalty and sedition very broadly, end quote. So the freedoms of speech and print, protected by the First Amendment, they had also not yet been legally defined by the courts. And so this enabled the state to violate the Constitution through means of censorship. In addition to suppressing Adventist speech and print, the state also regularly intercepted Adventist telegrams, confiscated their private mail, and secretly infiltrated their camp meetings and church services. As a result, the Adventist story during World War I, as narrated through the declassified Bureau of Investigation files, is one about enemies, aliens, socialists, and spies, four of the most common words that show up in their files. So let's start with Adventist school communities. The state considered the identification of a person as a Seventh-day Adventist to be sufficient reason for conducting surveillance of him or her, especially if they were also a member of the German race. The same was true of the Adventist school communities, which were comprised of faculty members, students, and residents who supported the school financially and through their service. The state surveilled Adventist schools for at least three reasons: fear of organized resistance to the military, classes taught in the German language, and sometimes they were suspected as being hideouts for German spies. So the local draft board for Walla Walla County, Washington, informed the BI that although they had no direct evidence to warrant suspicion, they felt that there was a possibility of some organized objection to the draft at College Place. College Place, of course, as you know, was home to Walla Walla College, and the writer emphasized that this was, quote, a Adventist community. The draft board claimed that this Walla Walla suburb, quote, practically in this suburb, that, quote, practically every registered man has made every claim for exemption that they can think of, and many of them are German or of German extraction, end quote. Others in the community were immigrants from Canada or England, and as a result, Adventists were claiming alienage as an exemption. Due to their religion and race, countless rumors came to the board of pro-German tendencies on the part of registrants from this community. The DOJ needed no further evidence or information than this, and they promptly began surveilling the Adventist community at College Place. The Adventist community in Marion County, Texas, that surrounded the Berea Seventh-day Adventist School, now known as Jefferson Christian Academy, experienced similar treatment from the state. D.L. Berry, secretary of the YMCA in Marion County, informed the Army Intelligence Office at Camp Travis that there had been, quote, an excessively large number of non-combatant cards presented by draftees from Marion County, Texas, end quote. Since the local draft board in this county appeared to be exceedingly liberal in their distribution of these cards, Army Intelligence forwarded Berry's report to the DOJ office in San Antonio. The DOJ then assigned the case to Agent Louis H. Henry, who soon found that, quote, only 2 non-combatant exemption cards were issued by the board, and they had been given to Seventh-day Adventists, one to Arthur E. Lacey and another to Frank N. Palmer. For the next several days, Agent Henry traveled through Marion County, interviewing Adventists about their religion, nationality, and loyalty to America. In the process, Henry learned that one more Adventist, George Colvin, had been granted a non-combatant card, but no others. Though 3 Adventists had been exempted, Agent Henry could find no condemning evidence against them. Lacey, Palmer, and Colvin were from families that had been Adventist members long before the war. Their parents were not of German ancestry, and, at least in Lacey's case, they had demonstrated their loyalty through the purchase of Liberty bonds. Their Adventist neighbors and minister, W.S. Lowry, likewise vouched for them. Since no evidence was found against them, the case was closed. The BI believed that the Adventist community in Muskegon, Michigan, was working with the Muskegon Socialist local and the international Bible students to spread anti-war socialist propaganda. Special Agent H.J. Cogger stated that these, quote, 3, quote, radical elements in Muskegon are amalgamating themselves, and he was concerned with the Adventists because they were very active. Their Swedish minister and elder Jorgensen was denounced as extremely radical in the FBI files, and Cogger emphasized that Jorgensen was, quote, so radical that a doctor branch of his church quit the same, end quote. Cogger stated in his report that Jorgensen, quote, preaches on a social revolution and the end of the world, taking his prophecies from the Bible, end quote. In addition to disloyal sermons, the BI was concerned about anti-American literature, and according to Agent Henry C. Edmonds, the Bureau believed that the Socialists Russellites and Adventists were working with, quote, a number of Russian Bolshevik agents to distribute a large quantity of radical literature among the sailors and soldiers of Detroit, Muskegon, and Grand Rapids, end quote. During World War I, the state made sure that schools throughout the U.S. banned German classes. This ban could be deftly mandated and monitored in public schools, but enforcing this in private schools was more challenging because these schools were not governed directly by the state. Though several Seventh-day Adventist schools, such as Lodi Academy and Union College, taught German prior to World War I, the need was so great that the church established an institution specifically for its German immigrants in 1910. In that year, the church acquired the property of the former Baird College, purchased local materials, and employed local citizens to remodel it and open it as the Clinton German Seminary. The institution was designed to train Adventist German-speaking ministers to serve in immigrant congregations in their native tongue, but some non-Adventists attended as well. In February 1918, during the midst of the war, the school had 215 students enrolled. Shortly after the U.S. entered World War I, the institution changed its name to the Clinton Theological Seminary, deleting the word German, to demonstrate American loyalty, but this did not convince concerned Clintonians that they could trust their German Adventist neighbors. In March 1918, Clay Adair, the Clinton postmaster, informed the Bureau of Investigation about CTS, stating, quote, while I have no proof against them, I have good reasons to suspect that they are pro-German, end quote. Before the end of the month, the BI commenced its open-ended investigation. Agent S.W. Dillingham traveled to Clinton and interrogated concerned citizens and CTS faculty members and students. CTS immediately responded to state pressure. The school began to fly the service flag over its entrance, and the faculty members wore bell buttons and organized a Third Liberty loan drive while students put together a baby bond and thrift stamp campaign and marched through the streets under a 100% American banner that said, "Help us can the Kaiser." CTS also publicly reported that several of their students had enlisted to fight for the U.S., while others, though entitled to exemption as ministers in training, had accepted the call to military service when drafted. During a faculty meeting on April 21, CTS took several more measures of decidedly patriotic nature. First, it was unanimously voted to discontinue the use of the German language in all public exercises of the school curriculum, including chapel exercises, the students' meetings, and religious worship. Second, the faculty decided to close the school on May 12 so that all the young men could contribute to the great national demand for efficient farm labor. Third, during the 3 weeks prior to the school closure, the faculty canceled all required evening classes and devoted as much of their remaining class time as possible to patriotic activism. The students endorsed all of these decisions and publicly declared, quote, themselves wholehearted Americans, loyal sons and daughters of the Stars and Stripes, end quote. Before the Clinton Theological Seminary closed on May 12, the faculty had raised more than $3,000 for Liberty bonds. CTS reopened at the conclusion of World War I a few months later, but it never regained its former strength. Like most other German churches in America, German Adventist congregations began to hold their services in English during the war in response to pressures from the state. Concurrently, as one Adventist observer stated, when the school went English during the war, it was more difficult to keep the German spirit strong, and the school permanently closed its doors in 1925. In this way, the state defeated the Clinton Theological Seminary, an institutional casualty of war. Some Adventist school communities were also suspected of harboring German spies. In April 1918, an Assyrian immigrant named Lazarus S. Malik wrote a series of letters to numerous state agents with information that he had on John M. Berkner. Berkner was a former doctor in the U.S. Army who had been indicted for violating the Espionage Act and was presently imprisoned in the Santa Fe, New Mexico penitentiary. According to Malik, Berkner was part of a gang of spies headquartered in College View, Nebraska, at the Adventist community surrounding Union College. The other members of this gang included a Dr. Thompson, Dr. Harold B. Miller, and Katerina Lafon. Malik claimed that this gang of spies used Adventism, quote, as a mask in order to get along anywhere as religious workers in their quest to rule the world and to bring the world under German culture, spelled with a K, and the German Kaiser, end quote. Malik claimed that Lafon was the secretary of this gang and the most dangerous member because, quote, All the information collected by the doctors Berkner, Miller, and Thompson were through her transmitted to Germany, end quote. Malik claimed to know her personally. He had become acquainted with her when he attended school in Hamburg, Germany in 1896. He asserted that, quote, she was sent to this country as a spy for the German government and as a Seventh-day Adventist missionary, end quote. Though Malik had lost contact with LaFawn, he assured numerous state agents that if she no longer lived in College View, that she could be located at some other Seventh-day Adventist institution. For Malik, this was a personal matter because he claimed that this Adventist spy gang had him arrested and thrown in the College View jail because he had denounced Germany in their presence. He was therefore prepared to take the witness stand and swear under oath the validity of his information. Well, the DOJ was thoroughly convinced by Malik's claims, and within a few days, the Bureau of Investigation opened an intense investigation of the Adventist community in College View. Agent Daniel C. Devlin was placed in charge and promised his superiors that he would, quote, make every effort immediately to locate Fräulein Katharina LaFawn, end quote. Devlin first contacted Malik personally, who informed them that he had recently seen LaFawn on O Street, Lincoln, Nebraska, walking with a man whose name was Reverend Miller from College View, and she was working in the German newspaper office in College View, a Seventh-day Adventist paper. Excuse me. He also gave Devlin a physical description of LaFawn, and with this information in hand, Devlin began the hunt. Devlin learned from the postmaster that no one in College View was receiving mail by the name LaFawn, and the postmaster also testified that he did not know anyone personally by that name. Devlin also interviewed H.A. Morrison, president of Union College, on several occasions that led nowhere. Morrison and Devlin poured through church records that included lists of missionaries for 1917 and found no one by the name of Katharina LaFawn. Morrison then assured Devlin that it would be almost impossible for anyone to be connected with the religious work in the church and use a false name. He then promised Devlin that he would continue to make careful inquiries. Devlin would go on to contact several current and former managers of Adventist publishing houses and their branch offices, including F.F. Byington, C.H. Jones, and S.N. Curtis. However, none of these men or their employees had ever heard of Katharina LaFawn. Persistent in his duty, Devlin also spoke with several Adventists in College View community or those who had previously lived there, but in every case, his search was futile. No Adventist had ever known anyone by the names of John M. Berkner, Dr. Thompson, Harold B. Miller, or Katharina LaFawn. In spite of this, Devlin remained convinced that this gang was connected with the Adventist Church, and the BI never officially closed the case file. I will add that in my research, I have never been able to track down those people either. Okay, let's move on to Adventist publishing houses, colporteurs, and print. So most Adventists were surveilled because they drew suspicion to varying degrees because of Adventist print culture. The state heavily surveilled every Seventh-day Adventist publishing house in America, including those operated independently from the church, such as the Evangel Publishing Society in Joplin, Missouri, and the D. Nordlich Publishing Company in Harvey, North Dakota. During World War I, the church operated three main publishing associations in America: Southern Publishing, the Pacific Press, and the Review and Herald. These presses worked closely with various branch offices and numerous tract and missionary societies throughout the country to distribute Adventist literature to the masses, and the BI kept record of the name and address of every single one. The Review and Herald Publishing Association was closely connected with the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. Their office buildings were built next to each other on the north side of Washington, D.C. And since this was the site of Adventist headquarters, it's not surprising that suspicions in this region could sometimes run wild. For example, the BI was convinced for a brief period of time that the Seventh-day Adventists were secretly using their office buildings at night to communicate with German spies. There were reports of, quote, queer flashes of light coming from the Review and Herald building at night, and ominous sounds that were thought to be from a wireless transmitter. But BI agent H.P. Alden failed to find any evidence of a wireless outfit in his covert investigation, and that he determined that the queer lights were caused by, quote, the night watchman making his rounds. Adventist colporteurs were the church's foot soldiers on the ground who sold Adventist publications door to door. Since they were involved in the actual distribution of Adventist print, they often experienced the harshest oppression by the state that the church experienced. Stella Campbell of Sacramento, California, had recently begun to work as a call porter to raise money to join her husband, who had moved to Portland, Oregon for work. Special Agent E.M. Blandford became suspicious of Campbell, and he sent a telegram to Special Employee F.W. Kelly, informing him that she had shipped 3 or 4 packages to herself by Wells Fargo Express. Blandford knew that these packages contained Adventist literature and informed Kelly, "Understand that these books have been barred from the mail." Yes, that's right. Some Adventist print was literally illegal to ship in the United States during this time. So the BI notified Wells Fargo that Campbell was charged with distributing seditious literature. That's his statement, his quote, and set up a 4-day stakeout near the Wells Fargo building to watch for Campbell. When she came to collect her packages, she was detained by BI agents and who opened all the packages, taking a sample of each for investigation. Excuse me. 2 agents then escorted her to the BI office in Sacramento for questioning. During the interrogation, the Bureau acquired Campbell's personal information, the name of her Adventist pastor in San Francisco, and learned that she had more Adventist print at home. Agents then followed her to her home and seized about 30 copies of literature, made Campbell swear that she was a loyal American, and forbid her to distribute any more Adventist literature. Finally, the Bureau analyzed the literature, taking note of every title, author, and price, and mailed it to Special Agent Blandford in San Francisco. Under pressure from the state, Campbell had to end her call porter work, but by 1920, after the war concluded, she had re-entered this profession. Numerous other call porters were harassed by the state. Ernest Max Trumner, who did write a missionary book later, by the way, was a German-born call porter and was imprisoned briefly as a German spy suspect. The local sheriff stopped the sale of all Adventist literature in Columbus, Ohio, forcing call porters to canvass elsewhere. John Milton, an Adventist call porter canvassing Boston, Massachusetts, was arrested by 2 provost guards, had his books confiscated, and was brought to the BI office in Boston for questioning. When W.F. Palmer, Special Assistant District Attorney, heard about Eloda Darling nesting and that she was selling A World in Perplexity, a book written by the General Conference president, he informed BI agent Leon Bone that, quote, she should be called upon the carpet, made to see the error of her way, and agree to cease the selling and circulation of this book, end quote. The Cincinnati police brought W.E. Bickett to the station for questioning because he was selling The World War, another book written by A.G. Daniels, and other Adventist literature. After receiving the 3rd degree, Special Agent Weekly escorted Bickett to the Bureau office for further interrogation, allowing him to leave only after he had agreed to discontinue the sale of these books. State agents also confiscated Adventist literature from those who had recently purchased it from call porters, and oftentimes these customers became the targets of state surveillance as well. So this leads us to censorship demands. So the Bureau of Investigation determined that it was possible for Adventist leaders at headquarters to be German spies because they were deeply suspicious of the denomination generally and what they printed specifically. So the state confiscated and or destroyed numerous Adventist periodicals, tracts, and books. Some magazines deemed suspicious included the Signs of the Times, Liberty Magazine, The Present Truth, and the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald. At least one Adventist journal, the Protestant Magazine, ended circulation in 1915 due to objections raised. Along with numerous tracts and books, these periodicals were often categorized by the state as socialist. For this reason, several Adventist cases regarding print are filed with those of socialist organizations such as the Industrial Workers of the World. In fact, in some cases, the BI struggled to distinguish between Adventism and the IWW, as in the case titled in regard to C. Stebben, IWW, or Religious Movement, Miami, Arizona. One of the suspicious books that Adventists published was Ellen G. White's The Great Controversy. This book was noted in BI case files since at least November 1915, when the agency became suspicious that an Adventist call porter selling it was, quote, a German secret agent. Though this book never caused as great a concern as other Adventist publications, it was deemed questionable by numerous state agents. In the summer of 1918, for example, several BI agents confiscated copies of The Great Controversy and inquired if it should be suppressed. The special agent to the Attorney General soon responded in a memo that the book did not warrant any action, but the DOJ received numerous inquiries regarding this book until the end of the war. During the summer of 1918, The state investigated the great controversy in conjunction with two books written by Arthur G. Daniels that were far more threatening, at least in the eyes of the state. The World War, its relation to the Eastern Question and Armageddon, published in 1917, and A World in Perplexity from 1918. Daniels was the president of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists during World War I, as well as one of the denomination's most prominent authors. Both of these books were damnable in the eyes of the state, but agents did not interpret their contents in the same manner. This highlights an important point regarding state surveillance of religion during World War I. The state had no clear guidelines for surveilling religion or determining violations of the Espionage Act. Some agents ascertained that a certain religious book was harmful, while others suggested that the same book was benign. When Special Employee McIntosh read the World War, he believed that Daniels's book was suspicious because it contained, quote, a mixture of Seventh-day Adventist prophecies with an element in which it partakes in its nature of the writings of some of the international Bible student organizations, end quote. BI informant Ian Hayag Jr. used stronger condemnatory language by asserting that both of Daniel's books were filled with, quote, pro-Hun propaganda. Similarly, Congregationalist minister and BI informant Burton A. Lucas damned the World War as, quote, an extreme premillenarian book with a Teutonic squint that had all the earmarks of German cunning and skill as a means of neutralizing American patriotism, end quote. In contrast, other state agents found these same books to be benign. Special Employee F.G. Gosling, quote, found nothing of a seditious nature in A World in Perplexity, and Agent C.B. Crossfield similarly concluded that, quote, although it contains nothing of an encouraging nature, it contains nothing in violation of any federal law, end quote. Agent H.A. Lewis was actually convinced by part of Daniel's thesis, and this I love this part. He was convinced by part of Daniel's argument in A World of Perplexity, and he actually reported to the Bureau that Daniel's arguments that, quote, the second advent of Christ was near at hand and would take a hand in the final settlement of the war, which is in part, without doubt, is right. So you actually thought Daniels had a point. Given that agents interpreted Daniel's books in contrasting ways, it is not surprising that the state rendered different judgments. Director A. Bruce Belaski, who is the director of the Bureau of Investigation, he stated that both A World in Perplexity and the World War had been examined by the department and that neither one was considered in violation of the Espionage Act, although A World in Perplexity, he said, was, quote, very close to the line. The War Department disagreed with the DOJ on this point, and they banned A World in Perplexity. Army and Navy libraries were forbidden to have the book, and soldiers and sailors had their copies confiscated and destroyed. The U.S. Postal Service likewise viewed these books differently than the DOJ, and they barred A World in Perplexity, the World War, and several other Adventist publications from the mail. The state, therefore, remained inconsistent with itself in regard to action taken. Though Adventists were surveilled throughout the entirety of the war, the state began to intensify its efforts during the spring of 1918. In April, Director Belaski ordered Agent C. Wade Wilkes to investigate Bible readings for the Home Circle, a popular evangelistic book published by Southern Publishing Association that had sold more than 1.25 million copies by that point. Wilkes' investigation of Bible readings in early 1918 led to an intense wave of surveillance of all Adventist publishing houses and tract and missionary societies. The state regularly confused Seventh-day Adventists with the International Bible Students, or Russellites, later Jehovah's Witnesses, during the World War, and in their opinion, each group was equally threatening. As a result, both religions were heavily surveilled, but the religious leaders of each faith suffered different outcomes. In May 1918, 8 Watchtower leaders were arrested under the Espionage Act, and on June 21, 7 of the men were sentenced to 80 years in prison, 20 years on each of 4 counts to run concurrently, so effectively 20 years in jail. And by the way, the 8th person got 10 years in jail. On June 25, just 4 days after this, the BI began intensely to pursue the Adventist leaders with the same intent. As E.R. Palmer, manager of one of the Adventist publishing associations, explained, quote, the authorities were very active in looking up the matter that we were publishing to see if we didn't belong in the penitentiary. And the same men who were instrumental under the government in putting the leaders of the Russellite movement in the penitentiary came to our headquarters to see where we belonged, whether inside or out, end quote. This wave of investigation initially revolved around Bible readings from the home circle, but it quickly encompassed dozens of other Adventist periodicals, tracts, and books. One of the books centrally featured in this controversy was Carlisle B. Haynes's book, The Return of Jesus, which was published in 1917. The Return of Jesus had been analyzed by the Assistant U.S. District Attorney in St. Louis, Missouri, who ascertained that, quote, a portion of this book is in violation of the late Sedition Act. He then forwarded his concern to Agent C. Wade Wilkes, who brought the book to Lee Douglas, the district attorney in Nashville. Douglas found, quote, the whole book was vicious and believed that some of the war illustrations are obviously inserted for unpatriotic purposes. For these reasons, the BI determined that, quote, this book should be stopped. All extant copies should be destroyed and a full report made as to the intent of the publishers with a possible view of prosecution, end quote. Agent Wilkes immediately applied state pressure on the Adventist leaders. He told them that The Return of Jesus was, quote, the most vicious publication he had ever seen, and that any further distribution of the book would be at their own risk. To avoid prosecution, R.L. Pierce, manager of the Southern Publishing Association, promised to cease further distribution of the book and furnished the BI with a list of all Adventist publishing houses and tract and missionary societies so that the state could verify that the remaining copies of Haynes' book and others were destroyed. After the remaining copies of The Return of Jesus and other contraband were liquidated, or at least so they thought, the state allowed that revised versions of these books could be published if they passed by the chief military censor. And I have one of these books in my office here somewhere. Many censored Adventist books explicitly acknowledge the fact that they had been censored, and they actually say so. They bear an imprint that says passed by the chief military censor with a certain date. But some Adventist books concealed the fact that they had been censored, like the Bible readings for the home circle. When it was revised, there was nothing stated in the book that it had been censored by the government. Though the revisions of all Adventist publications played a significant role in repositioning Adventism as a patriotic and loyal religion, censorship demands also compelled Adventist leaders to revise one of their core doctrines. Since 1850, Seventh-day Adventists had argued that the two-horned beast of Revelation 13 represented the United States of America. According to Adventist interpreters, the two horns on this beast represented America's ostensible support of the timeless principles of civil and religious liberty. And I'll add here that this is one of the primary arguments used by Adventists to fight against slavery and Jim Crow oppression in the antebellum period. And so they use this doctrine as a very radical way to speak out against racism. But America, the Adventists claimed, was a dragon-speaking beast because it denied these liberties, these civil and religious liberties, to minorities. And during the antebellum period, their primary argument is that Black people are being oppressed. And so this is proving that America is not just the beast at some future point, but it is the beast right now. And so this was significant. After the Civil War, Adventists continued to use this doctrine to condemn American imperialism, which you should read Jeffrey Rosario's dissertation for more on that. During World War I, however, the state determined that this teaching was anti-100% American, which was the motto of the time. You had to be 100% American. And if Adventist leaders wanted to avoid the penitentiary, they needed to change this doctrine. And so I'm taking this insights here from the work of Doug Morgan. So they continued to, they did so, that is, the Adventist leaders did so. They censored Bible readings and changed this doctrine in Bible readings for the home circle, beginning with the chapter title. The title in the 1916 edition was The United States in Prophecy, Making an Image to the Beast. And the censored edition, which is the edition that we still publish today and is still around today, the words United States are removed so that it now read, Making an Image to the Beast, the prophecy of Revelation 13. The role of America was also recast throughout the rest of the chapter. For example, the 1916 edition clearly emphasized that America itself was the two-horned beast. But under censorship, Adventist leaders now stated that, quote, within the territory of the United States, an ecclesiastical movement would arise that would exercise a dominating control not only in the civil government of this country, but also in other nations of the world, the whole world as well. end quote. So when some Adventist leaders reinterpreted, and this is a little bit subtle, but is significant, they reinterpreted the two-horned beast to represent a liberal or modernist, quote, ecclesiastical movement within the United States. In other words, not the government itself. And it was this agency that was dangerous, not America, not the country, not the nation, not the federal government. Reinterpreting the enemy within as liberal Protestantism and communist infiltrators facilitated the Adventist courtship with the fundamentalists during the interwar period. And you can look to Michael Campbell's recent works on this for more information. But according to the historian Douglas Morgan, this doctrinal shift also led to three lasting changes within the denomination. First, Adventists began to neglect the civil horn of their two-horned beast after World War I. And, quote, as Doug says, little attention was given to the nation's performance in the realization of human rights beyond religious liberty. In other words, after this point, it all becomes about, oh, America's going to become this beast at some point when there's a national Sunday law. And that's the version that I grew up with, which we still have prevalent today. Second, before World War I, Adventists had typically ascertained that America was currently a persecuting power because of its undemocratic treatment to minorities, specifically African Americans, but also Native Americans to some degree as well. But after World War I, Adventists tended to emphasize that America, after its liberal Protestant takeover, would only become beastly at some future point. So that's a subtle but significant difference. Finally, imagining the liberal Protestant takeover in America, that it would become a, quote, worldwide persecuting power, gave the prophecy greater global significance as Adventists continued to expand their worldwide missionary enterprise. And we might add, as America as a nation became sort of like a world police. Now, let me see what we're at on time. I've been going 36 minutes. I can give a final section before I conclude if you would like that.
Just keep going.
Keep going? Okay, let's talk.
Give us the whole load.
All right, let's talk about reorganizing the denomination. So Adventist leaders were able to make this doctrinal shift because their encounters with the state led to the creation of new cogs in denominational machinery. Call porters and evangelists proved to be lightning rods for controversy during World War I, and church leaders determined that they needed to be more thoroughly monitored. The call porters delivered Adventist print from door to door, but they had been a perceived threat primarily because of the books that they had sold. Therefore, call porters could be better managed by protecting and censoring the print. Evangelists, on the other hand, openly proclaimed the Adventist message through printed flyers and newspaper advertisements for their lectures, as well as the lectures themselves. And they also used the prominent display of stage props, including apocalyptic beasts. And they had very dynamic sermons, which called for the end of the world and all sorts of other stuff. And so they too were disparaged. Their activity was disparaged by Adventist leaders in the wake of World War I and during World War I as sensationalists. And so the rise, or I should say anti-sensationalism, was the new watchword for Adventist leaders. So the Adventist leaders dealt with aspects of material culture by redesigning depictions of their two-horned beast. As Ronald D. Graybill and Douglas Morgan have noted, the fierce lion-like beast of the 19th century became a benign buffalo in the wake of World War I, an image shift that reflected the recent theological change. And this shift was promoted by publishers and administrators, but advertising and policing speech, the preaching, the sermons, also required new organizational cogs and strategic maneuvering. And Harold B. Weeks has written about many of these changes in evangelism, but he was unaware. He wrote about this in the 1960s, but he was unaware about the state surveillance issue and how the state played a major role here. And so I'm relying and building on the work of Harold B. Weeks, whose dissertation actually was published by the Review and Herald in 1967. I think the only dissertation ever published by the church, I mean, at least in a popular press. Though unaware that the state played a central role, the historian Howard B. Weeks documented this major shift in Adventist evangelism and the new cogs installed to enact it. Beginning in 1919, with the infamous 1919 Bible Conference, the church began to hold Bible conferences in ministerial associations and institutes to train evangelists to avoid sensationalism in their ministry. Particular attention was given to advertising, and restrictive guidelines were officially adopted to promote a positive image of Adventism in the press. Those who passed through the mandatory ministerial training were instructed to emphasize Christ and peace and to downplay Adventist distinctives such as the two-horned beast. Perhaps to weed out the sensationalists, church officials began to take many evangelists out of the field and to assign them an administrative role or make them a pastor of a local church, which, by the way, was not previously done. Previously, Adventist congregations didn't have resident ministers. Finally, a new emphasis in foreign missions drew some attention away from evangelism in the United States, so that by the time of World War II, Adventism, as presented by evangelists, had a different look, sound, and character. The state also played an important role in the large-scale denominational restructuring that transpired in 1918. 5 years earlier, during the 1913 General Conference, the Adventist Church had created a new level of organization known as division conferences as a means to distribute the responsibilities previously held by the General Conference. Division conferences, which are not like divisions today, by the way, division conferences had their own constitutions and constituencies and enabled Adventists in these locales to have a direct voice in church affairs on their continent. European Adventists found this system of organization to be particularly beneficial and important. They proposed this new organizational plan, and the European Division Conference, or the EDC as I'll call it, was the first to be organized. The North American Division Conference was quickly organized thereafter, and plans were made to organize ones for Asia and South America. The Great War, however, made American Adventists aware of problems previously unseen. Since division conferences were quasi-parallel structures of authority to the GC, it was possible that the church on an entire continent could split away from the other bodies if a conflict such as a war arose. So during the war, American Adventist leaders worried that they were drifting apart from their brethren in enemy lands. The European Division Conference also governed lands in Europe that were at war with each other, which American leaders believed created, quote, an embarrassing situation, end quote. As a result, at the 1918 General Conference session, a session almost entirely composed of American Adventists recommended that all division conferences be discontinued. But this was only a recommendation. This proposal was discussed and adopted as a recommendation, but the actual dissolution of the division conferences required approval from those entities themselves. Delegates from the North American Division Conference were present and quickly ratified the GC recommendation during their business sessions. Though primarily composed of American delegates, the Asiatic and South American Division Conferences were also abolished, primarily because they had been officially organized just 3 days before by the Americans. The European Adventists were absent from these discussions, and since they comprised the second largest sector of Adventism, the Americans postponed further action until the European Division Conference could meet to discuss the GC's recommendation. Therefore, when the 1918 General Conference session adjourned, the Division Conference organizational structure technically remained intact. A short time later, however, the state intervened, and this occurred at the precise time that the state intensified its surveillance of Russellism and Adventism that I previously described. So during this process, the BI quickly learned that the Adventist Church not only propagated allegedly subversive teachings, but they also had numerous global connections, particularly with Europe. According to Adventist leaders, the Bureau of Investigation was particularly concerned that the General Conference in America funneled money to the European Division Conference and that the EDC in turn dispersed money to its Latin Union. Thus, the Adventist Church seemed to sustain a subversive network between Central and Allied powers, because the Latin Union were in the peace, they were in the Allied portion, and other portions like Germany were part of course, the anti-American powers. So during the war, Louis R. Conradi was the EDC president, and they were headquartered in Germany, Hamburg, Germany, which was enemy territory. And the Latin Union at this time oversaw the churches in Allied or neutral territories in France, French Switzerland, Spain, Italy, North Africa, and Portugal. In light of countless other complaints, suspicions, and fears, such as intimate ties between the Central and Allied powers, these seemed to confirm that the Seventh-day Adventist Church was overrun with German spies. As a result, American Adventist leaders claimed that the state pressured them to abolish the European Division Conference without the consent of the Europeans, an action the American Adventists were not authorized to make. To prove their loyalty to their nation and to avoid the penitentiary, the Americans agreed to abolish the EDC and, by extension, the entire Division Conference organizational schema. After the war, the American Adventists had to explain this delicate situation to the Europeans, hoping that they would accept the organizational change without a schism. It was the Europeans, after all, who had first proposed the division conferences, and the Americans were unsure if the Europeans had become disenchanted with division conferences since they last had met in 1913. The reunion had two phases. First, 4 European delegates met with the Americans in Boulder, Colorado in October 1919 and requested that American administrators travel to Europe to meet on their own soil. The Americans agreed and immediately set sail. These meetings convened in the Skodsborg Sanitarium in Denmark in November. At both meetings, American Church Administrator W.T. Knox explained that, quote, the United States Department of Justice and War Board questioned financial relationships between centers in the Latin Union and other portions of Europe and required the dissolving of the European Division Organization if the General Conference Treasury were to be allowed to have business connections with institutions in the Latin Union, particularly the Spanish publishing work, end quote. Rather than defiantly protest, the former EDC president, L.R. Conradi, reluctantly acknowledged that, quote, the war made it impracticable for the present, at least, to have now a European Division Conference. Nevertheless, he only begrudgingly did so, and in an elegiac plea, he called for, quote, some means or arrangement for mutual counsel and for the conduct of mission enterprises, end quote. It was already a dead issue, however, and the Europeans were expected to accept and adopt the organizational plan that the Americans had formulated, and they did so, even if reluctantly. Though the American Adventists had recommended that division conferences be abolished prior to direct state involvement, the state played a central role in the actual dissolution of division conferences. European Adventists were expected to accept this reality ex post facto, which denied them their rightful voice and authority and preemptively subdued any potential resistance to this large-scale change. In short, the European Adventists had the authority to reject the GC's recommendation. But while such an action was possible, that potential outcome remains far from certain, and it is perhaps unlikely. Regardless, it is significant to note that the state played an important role in shaping the denominational structure that the Seventh-day Adventist Church uses to this day. Now let's conclude. At every turn, American Seventh-day Adventist leaders chose to meet state demands. They propagated patriotism and fostered loyalty to the American state, censored and discontinued their print, revised key doctrines, created and monitored new methods of evangelism, and abolished the European Division Conference, all to appease the state and avoid the penitentiary. After witnessing many of these changes, one state agent remarked with pride that the Seventh-day Adventist Church had proven itself to be, quote, a very worthy organization, end quote. State surveillance had a moral effect, he said, upon this religion that was, quote, beneficial and will cause the authorities of this church to be particularly vigilant in the future, end quote. By meeting the numerous demands made by the federal government in many key ways, but not every way, of course, church leaders demonstrated their willingness to refashion Seventh-day Adventism in the image of the American state. That's it. I can show you a few pictures too, if you'd like to see the changes to the beasts and stuff like that while you're maybe processing some of this.
Yeah, please do so. I'm really interested in this. I've always loved the, yeah, you explained it to me. I've got a very early copy of that. And then later on the buffalo.
So, okay, it kind of starts with this ferocious, you can see this ferocious beast rising up out of the sea, the earth, excuse me. And it's sort of a lion, leopard, bear combination. And they do that because the early Adventists interpreted the United States as being sort of an oppressive force that was sort of made in the image of the papacy. And so In Revelation, it's described, the first beast that comes out of the sea, which you see in the background here, is described as having the lion, leopard, bear combinations, which we associate with the book of Daniel as well. So it's sort of this conglomeration aspect. So they characterize it that same way. You see jagged teeth. My favorite version of this image is Uriah Smith's engraving that has two chains behind the back legs of the beast, one with a banner that reads creeds, one that reads slavery. It really shows why they viewed America as this oppressive power at that time. But slowly this will change. In the late 19th century, you start to see that the lion becoming a little bit more just like a lion. And then here's what it looked like in the wake of World War I. And the images are here reversed. World War I was the buffalo. By World War II, it's the lamb. So it becomes a cute image, and you can see this just changing, and it's happening right at this time. Now, as Ron Graybill pointed out in his Insight article decades ago,
Kevin, we're not seeing the second image.
Oh, you're not seeing what?
We're not seeing the second image. You said the image changed.
What are you seeing right now?
The first one with the image of the papacy, that very first picture you had of.
Oh, that. Okay. Hold on. I'm showing you. I thought I was showing you this other thing. Sorry, I thought I was showing you this.
Okay.
So here's this lion, leopard, vicious, creature coming up out of the land. And then later it becomes, in the late 19th century, it's sort of tamed like a regular lion. And then World War I, it becomes a benign buffalo. And this is right around the time that the buffalo nickel comes out, 1912. And so the buffalo is sort of rising up as a symbol. And then by World War II, it's a cute little lamb. And so this is very interesting. You even to this day, we don't see America and prophecy as being an oppressive force. It's usually depicted visually in some sort of cute way. And that's changed. And a lot of the reason that's changed is because of the government. Here, by the way, are what some of the declassified files look like. Here is one of the files on the Return of Jesus, that damnable book there, where they list all of the tract and missionary societies, all of them, and they list also the 3 publishing houses here. And they took photocopies, I guess it was actual photographs of the book, and they're upset with images like this, where Haynes had a sign here with, that's fostering, that's dealing with the labor issue. So labor today is not getting a just proportion of that which it produces. And so Haynes was taking the side of labor. And so he's got this paragraph here that they're circling, and justice to labor, right? Clouds of evil. And there's pictures of here about labor riots. Great changes will come, and the mob will bring them, and so this kind of stuff is very concerning to the government, and the reason that they're viewing this stuff as socialist. And Adventists at this time, a lot of them were leaning on the side of labor. Here you see the Present Truth, an Adventist periodical published in Washington, D.C. that's going to be canceled in 1915 due to objections. And there's an article here on the World in Perplexity that will become a book. And they've got copies of that. They've circled it. They've underlined things here. Peace, freedom, and representative government, constructive work and wealth, education, science, and art. All of these things are in the world's maelstrom. And so it sounds anti-100% American. They circled this paragraph here. Deep-seated discontent has seized upon the masses. They must indeed be deaf who do not hear the mutterings of the approaching storm. And so in general, the government does not know how to read premillennialist literature, but also Adventists are not entirely as conservative at this period as we thought they were. And so that's causing lots of questions in the eyes of the state. And I think you may have lots of questions. So let's get into that.
All right. Thank you so much, Kevin. Riveting presentation. I don't think I've ever seen the chat so quiet during the seminar. So really, thank you for sharing, your research with us. It is truly been interesting just to kind of see, the different investigations that were happening and the different things that people found strange and reported. It's quite a bit to unpack, but just encouraging the rest of the class while you're unpacking everything, as your questions come up, to just raise your hands. So as a reminder, if you click on the reactions icon, then you can raise your hand and we will call on you as best as possible in the order in which the hands are raised. And we will then ask you to unmute and to join the conversation. So Lauren, your hand has been up for some time, so please go ahead and get the conversation started.
Okay, Kevin, this is fascinating to me. I told everybody at the beginning that I am one of those German Adventists.
Oh boy.
100% German. Grew up in the heart of North Dakota, where all the Germans were. When I was young, and you have to think about this. I'm 68 now, but still, this is not that long ago. This was in the 60s. We still had church in German.
Okay. So it didn't die everywhere. Yeah.
No, it did not.
That's good. Good to know.
I do not remember. One of the things that surprised me here, that this whole area, North Dakota. You mentioned Harvey.
Yeah.
That's where Cheyenne River Academy was. Everybody there was German. All of us were German farmers. Lincoln, Nebraska. That's where all of us went to school, and 90% of us in Union College were Germans.
Mm-hmm.
What really surprised me was this notion that we were somehow spies. That was the part that struck me the hardest. I thought it would mostly focus on Revelation 13, which I find a very radical notion, that the United States government is going to turn on us under the direction of. I had always connected it with nativism, all these Italians and Irish coming in, and that anti-Catholic strain was very strong in my community. I've told this story before, and people are probably tired of it, but when John F. Kennedy was elected president in our little church, people were weeping.
Yeah.
This was the time of the end. 3 years later, when he was assassinated, I remember the pastor getting up and said, "Praise the Lord. He's held back the winds of strife by killing the president." I mean, some of these things are shocking to me, even to say it, Kevin.
Sure.
But the part that, as you were talking, I got to thinking a little bit that in my community, even though many of their children served in the armed forces in World War II, I could still remember talking to my grandpa one time and asking him, "What did you think of Hitler?" And he said, without too much thought about it, this was after the war, this was around 1960, he said, "Well, we thought he was pretty good. He was bringing us around, bringing the German people, the German government back. So we didn't know till later how bad he was." So it's very interesting to me that these concepts kind of survived on into even my lifetime, Kevin.
Yeah.
Which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. It does really touch close to home, I think. And I think you in part lived through the ultimate victory over this, because what happens is the church, this is overly simplistic, but let me be overly simplistic for the sake of a point. The church responds to World War I by really emphasizing, especially during the interwar period in World War II, that we are really staunch patriots and so forth. And Desmond Doss becomes the crowning achievement of this sort of new Adventism. And we published so many books, I mean, dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of books on Adventists in World War II. I mean, they are everywhere and they're still being published. But there is hardly anything on Adventists in World War I. Or any of the wars before that, almost nothing, no kind of patriotism, no trying to show that like we are loyal to God and country, even though we observe the Sabbath and don't carry guns on our shoulders. And the ultimate pinnacle capstone of this is Operation Whitecoat, isn't it? Which you should, I'm sure you know about quite well. Where
my friend served in it.
Yeah,
I was a little too young. I missed it by a couple of years, but my friend served.
Yeah. But for those who don't know, Operation Whitecoat was the joint operation between the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists and the federal government and the U.S. Army, where we had this Project Whitecoat that ran out of primarily Fort Detrick in Maryland, and Adventists to the tune of a few thousand were human test subjects, and they would give them all sorts of bacteria and viruses and so forth to combat chemical warfare, germ warfare. And so we're worried about germ bombs and other kinds of things and viruses and so forth. And there are many positives that came out of this, right? I mean, we got vaccinations for hepatitis A and B and the flu, the plague, and there's a whole bunch. There's at least 19 or 20. And it also helped put America on the moon, because several of the people in Operation Whitecoat worked for NASA, and they were pumped with West Nile fly virus and other kinds of things, and to see if they could maneuver the spacecraft back to Earth under the worst possible conditions of sickness. And so, that's a really fascinating tale. But like, the point I'm making is that it shows that by this time, by the mid-20th century, Adventism wants to be fully engaged and working in harmony with the government, whereas we were not doing that before. The two-horned beast doctrine changed a lot. This is the best way to illustrate it. And so you're associating it with nativism. That's a 20th century invention. That wasn't happening before that. Adventists were they tended to be anti-nativist, and so forth. They condemn nativist riots and other kinds of things, even though they are anti-Catholic. Okay, so try to put those together. But they're speaking against injustices to minorities. Now, they are Protestant minorities, yes, but they're speaking against racial minorities and other religious minorities that are not Catholic. And they're very anti-imperialism. During the Spanish-American War period and up through World War I, they're denouncing American anti-imperialism outside of the U.S. as America is acquiring other territories and other places to become the empire that it is today. And so that is tamed very heavily. And so the way that we have been taught these things has been filtered through a particular kind of censored rhetoric.
I'm fascinated by that. You're kind of blowing my mind here, and it sounds like it was also in that same period that Seventh-day Adventists became anti-union.
Yeah, I think so. And you see books like the Country Living and so forth rising up in the wake of these kinds of things. And so, I think that this plays a big role. I mean, think about Ellen White. If you look at Ellen White has some socialist leanings. She's not, you can't say she's a socialist, but look at what she talks about land reform, for example. She talks about everyone should have equal access to the land. And that's a very socialist kind of argument. And she gives that in the book. I think she gives it in Education as well as maybe Ministry of Healing. She has a chapter on it. So, and there's other aspects too. She condemns capital as well as labor. So she tries to hold a more balanced position there. And so, our Adventist pioneers were a lot more radical than we've ever given them credit for. In fact, it's abundantly clear to me from my dissertation research that we began as a liberal movement. There was
and yet they're more liberal, but yet they weren't abolitionists.
Oh, they were abolitionists. That's the thing that I found, is they actually were. Historians got that wrong, actually. So we were abolitionists. We did not retreat from the movement. We did continue in the cause there. And in just about every kind of way you look at it, we were on the liberal side of that day. And you can't necessarily translate that to today, but we were on the liberal side of issues at that time. And so some people, I'm making that point because some people have tried to argue that we've been fundamentalists from the beginning, and that isn't true if you put us in the proper comparative context.
Fascinating. Okay. Hey, thank you so much. This is amazing stuff.
Yeah, and thanks for that question, Lauren. And as you were speaking, I was reminded of some commentary that I've seen where Adventists were supportive of Hitler because he was a strong leader. He was vegetarian. He didn't drink alcohol. So he seemed to have aligned very nicely, and so, in spite of all the other things that he did, there were Adventists who were in support of that. Did any of the investigations uncover any of that, Kevin?
No, my research has only gone up through really 1918. There's a couple reports I've seen. There was an Adventist mother and her two sons who were thrown into an insane asylum in Colorado because the one son of hers that was in the military didn't want to bear arms. And so for whatever reason, the government decided to round up the soldier, his brother who wasn't in the military, and the mother, and threw them all into the insane asylum. And so they were finally let out through the advocacy of the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, which is still in existence today. But that didn't happen until the 1920s. And so I've seen some things go up until that point, but I haven't touched World War II. But I can say from other things I've read and researched a bit that, yeah, German Adventists in during the World War II era primarily supported Hitler. Most of them did. And yeah, for the reasons that you've mentioned that were mentioned, I guess, in the chat. So, but that was not the norm throughout Europe. So the Allied countries, as you would expect, they didn't, and so forth. And so we have a mixed story when it comes there. It was not the norm, but we even have some Adventists who were part of the underground. The most famous, of course, was John Friedrich Widener, who ran the Dutch Paris escape route and helped about 1,000 Jews escape Nazi Germany or Nazi occupied territory.
Okay, thanks, Kevin.
Yeah.
Ayanda, you are next. Am I correct in thinking you're joining us from South Africa?
Yes, you're right, ma'am. I'm coming from very cold South Africa right now. Yes.
Welcome.
Thank you. Well, Kevin, thank you for that presentation. It's mind-blowing. I've always heard rumors that the Adventist Church was always under surveillance, but I always thought it was because of the Branch Davidians and all that brought federal investigations towards the church and everything that happened then. But what you've just brought to the forum for me is mind-blowing. So now I've got two questions.
Mm-hmm.
One is how sure are we that the doctrines and all the teachings that we have as the church are not Fed influenced, that are still biblically pure, that they are not influenced by the federal government of America, and that we are still safe as an organization? Because if the surveillance happened during or after the First World War, that's when the doctrinal development of the church really took shape, and the scholarship. So if the federal government was really keeping tabs on us and doing all those stuff, how sure are we that what we are teaching the people is really what the Bible is saying, and it's not what it's just making the government comfortable? Secondly, are we still under surveillance? That's just your opinion. Are we still under surveillance? I know I'm speaking in South Africa. Yeah. Ours is kind of different. I don't think our government really bothers what Adventists are doing. But I mean, in terms of in the whole region, are we still under surveillance? And and I saw a comment in the comment section, somebody was saying that maybe persecutions are not really going to come in terms of the day of worship, but we're just going to be enemies of the state because of some of the things we speak about in Revelations and Daniel and stuff like that. Yeah. So how are we standing in terms of how we and the government is standing? Thanks.
Great. I'm going to take your second question first because I think it's easier. I don't think that Adventists are being surveilled by the government in the United States now. And the reason is because Adventism has demonstrated to the government for decades now that we're loyal, good people. Every election season, you're going to see presidential candidates making a video to the Adventists and thanking us for all that we've done. And they'll typically talk about, maybe religious liberty, but oftentimes it's typically health and our hospital system and all of that. And people know a bit more about Adventists today than they did. And so, no, I don't think that the Adventist church as a whole is being surveilled. I do suspect that there are some crazy Adventists, I mean that word in just sort of a general sense, that probably are under the eyes of the government because they should be. We have people in the church who were criminals, and so I do hope the government is surveilling them. But no, as a church, as a denomination as a whole, no, I don't think so. And that won't happen again unless Adventism somehow becomes odious to the government. And it's not. I'm not convinced that the Sabbath is going to ever bring that about unless other issues are added to it, or things change. Things would have to change, as Ellen White talks about. Things would have to change in some way for the Sabbath to become a major divisive issue. It's not currently. Maybe it will be at some point, but it's not now. But issues of race, ethnicity, gender, those things are alarming society today. Now, what about your first question? That's a doozy of a question. That's a loaded question, and it's a fair one to ask. And it really should be answered through further research, but I will assist with some of the things that I've seen. So first of all, what we have to recognize and remember is that when we started as a denomination, we were, I would say, I think it's fair to say, we're not just anti-Catholic, we're anti-evangelical. Please remember that we came out of Babylon, and Babylon, friends, was the Protestant churches in America. And we come out of Babylon because we find that the American churches are just as oppressive as the papal church was, according to the argument, right, in the Middle Ages, right? So the arguments that the pioneers are giving is, look at slavery. Slavery is the clearest sign of this. And they'll talk about how the church is the right arm of the slave power. And so as a result of this, we see that the evangelicals are not necessarily our openly sworn enemies, but they are damned to hell, right? And so that's where we begin. Now, during World War I, there's a lot of stuff going on in America. It is, and this is mainly where the church is still at. 1921, we will begin to have more members outside of the U.S. than in the U.S., but we're still slightly the majority in 1917 and 18. And a lot's changing in America at this time. And all of this, we have to remember that culture always shapes the church. Now, a lot of conservatives today, maybe even liberals too, I usually hear from conservatives, are going to tell you, we have to avoid following the culture of the day. Friends, we always follow the culture of the day. You're just choosing which culture you're going to follow. It's going to be one culture or another. And so Adventists were following initially a very radical culture that was anti-slavery, that was supportive of women and leadership roles, and lots of other things that were very radical today. This is going to change. And so in the early years of the 20th century, we start to see the counter-cult movement rise up. This is in addition to the government surveillance and everything, where evangelicals are now going to start pointing at Adventists and say, you are a cult. And we had never been called a cult before, but this is starting to rise up at this time, and it really hurts us. And one of the main reasons they call us a cult is because we're founded by a woman. Our denomination is founded by a woman, Ellen White. And so gender issues are in the mix. And you see many Adventist women into the hundreds who are serving in leadership roles and so forth. And the church is going to find ways to kick them out to where by 1940, there are literally zero serving in leadership capacities. And so this is all happening in the same kind of time. And so we are starting to try to react and respond, not just to the federal government, but to evangelicals, because we want to be respected by them. We want to become like them again to some degree, because other things are rising up, like evolution, the so-called modernist type of issues. And so Adventists literally do start to sort of court favor with fundamentalism. But the fundamentalists don't know if they want us or not because of Ellen White. And things like the sanctuary doctrine and so forth. And so we push, and people like Leroy Edwin Froome push really hard, and eventually there's questions on doctrine and other kinds of things that are written to prove that we really are evangelicals. Now, I am not against necessarily the things that Froome say. So like, I'm not touting a conservative line here. I'm saying historical fact, this is motivating what Froome is doing. And what Froome is doing is very different than what the pioneers were doing. That's not necessarily good or bad. It just is. There's probably good aspects and bad aspects when we really look at it. And so Froome is really doing this, and we sort of win whenever Walter Martin and so forth says, oh, we're not really a cult. And so that's how we consider that to be sort of a victory in like the late 50s and early 60s. And so all of this there's a lot going on here. And how do we know our doctrine is pure and biblical and untainted? Well, this is simply a reminder that our interpretation of Scripture is always framed through our own worldview, through our own perspective, and it can never be the same as the first century context. I'm not sure what we mean by purely biblical, untainted, or whatever, because humanity always taints divine truth. We cannot avoid that. And so what we have to be very careful is to always go back to Scripture, to bang our heads on Scripture. And I think there's a lot of value in Ellen White and her counsel. And so we go through her as well, and we see how these things can help us navigate our current era to the best of our ability. And thank God we serve a merciful God, because all of us have screwed up and we've all fallen short of the glory of God, and we all need a Savior. And thank God we have one. And so how can we know if we have untainted truth? Let me tell you this.
Sorry.
We can't, and we do. Our truth is tainted. That sounds horrible to say, but I only mean it in the sense that humanity always messes things up. So there's at least some taint. That doesn't mean we're barred from salvation. Okay. I hope that makes sense. I don't know. Please
Thanks,
react.
Kevin. That definitely does make sense. And it would be good to hear leaders in the church admit that. But we won't hold our breaths. Clarence, time for you to join the conversation.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for the presentation. That was great. You've practically answered all my question. But since I'm on, I'll ask it anyway. Let me see, isn't it characteristic of conservative religions to tweak their doctrines, tweak it in order to conform to the state line, to what the authorities are saying, to stay in line with the authorities?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, keep going.
And doesn't that show a shift toward conservatism in a historical setting? That is to say, an organization that may have been radical in the beginning has now become conservative. And finally, let me just ask, do we have any examples of this happening right now?
Good. So great question. That was almost more of a comment too. Yes, I think that we have to define words like conservative to really know what we mean here. And I would say that this is more of a conservative problem than it is a liberal problem. And why? That's because I think that scholars who describe conservatism as the fear of losing power as being on the right track. And so people who are conservative in general are trying to conserve something. And they're generally conserving something because they're trying to protect the privileges and power that they have. And so when we start, as I've shared before, yes, we were not concerned about those things. We were lashing out against the government, against the massive churches in America, et cetera. We were lashing out against majority society, and we were definitely on the side of minorities and when we began. But that does shift, and I do see a conservative turn in the church, and so forth. And so that is coloring all of the things that we see happening and changing. And I do think that it's probably more of a conservative problem. Now, that doesn't mean I think liberalism and liberals are without problems. They have different kinds of problems, but you mentioned conservatism, so I'm only speaking to one side of it. I think we should all try to strive to do the best. I have major problems if we're thinking of conservative and liberal with parties, which I think is a horrible definition. But if you're thinking of it that way, I have personally problems with both Republicans and Democrats, mostly Republicans, yes, but the Democrats have not ever met my standard either. And so I wish that somebody would.
Kevin.
Yes.
I'm tempted to think that growth has something to do with it. That is to say, when an organization, a religious organization, is small, it tends to be radical.
Yep, you're right.
We are the faithful few,
Absolutely.
and the others constitute the world.
That's right.
But then when we grow and we become majority, or we become close to it, or we have a big following,
Yep.
we are part of the world. And therefore we just have to try to preserve the status quo or whatever. So it seems to me that there is a dynamic that plays there in the growth relationship.
Absolutely.
When we grow, we tend to become conservative and we lose the sting. We are no longer there to be like the bees, but we are probably, we become lamb-like. We are lambs and we keep the status quo. It seems to me.
Yeah, I think you're right. And there's really no way, I don't know that there's a way to avoid that. And I think just about every religion who's ever gone through a sort of a development to the growth points that you're talking about has probably experienced the same kind of conservative turns. The Mormons for sure, same kind of situation. And they are very supportive of the government, whereas they were literally at war with the US. The Mormon wars were elapsing for several years for a period of time out west and so forth. And so they've had a major kind of shift as well. And you're right, it is a lot to do with growth. We're adding more diversity of thought, more ideas, more bodies. And the General Conference today, they have to try to keep us all together somehow. And so that's not an easy task. And so I am hoping that we can be understanding of these developments. We can't just say, oh, we've messed up and gone off the deep end here. I mean, there is good that has come as well as bad. And it's a mess in a sense, but we live with that mess. And that's okay, because God has told us it's going to be messy until everything's made perfect again. So we just move on to the best of our ability, I guess. And I do hope and pray that our church collectively can continue its best to chart a healthy path forward. Although, as we all know, we have our debates and they are important.
All right. Thanks so much for that question, Clarence, and for your response, Kevin. Carmen, I always look forward to your insights, so please join the conversation.
That's why you do such a good job. You're so diplomatic. Thank you, Kevin. So interesting, and I've enjoyed reading things from you in the past. So thank you for being here. I'm going to post a link in the chat because you're talking about Carlisle B. Haynes.
Oh, yeah.
I've been surprised recently to learn, one, how very prominent he was. He was an administrator and he was an author. He was head of whatever the Adventist Commission against unions were, which, got compared to you're going to be defeated like the Russian, or become animalistic like the Russian revolutionaries.
Yeah.
And he was a racist. There's stuff about him. It's horrible.
No.
So this book that I put a link to really surprised me because it was published by the Review and Herald in 1940. And what are they thinking with that cover? That looks like Hitler.
Yeah, well, Adventists were involved, at least to some degree, with the eugenics movement, race betterment. It smacks to me of that kind of image as well.
And it was used, I found it up to, this wasn't any kind of an exhaustive search, but I found it even with the same cover being published by the Review and Herald in 1966.
Sure. Well, I don't know if people made that connection back then. It certainly can evoke those kind of thoughts today, but.
Well, I just wonder why it didn't kind of jar a little bit back then, since they knew what was happening in Europe. That rather disturbing. But here's my question. You said because of what was happening during World War I, then the development of settled pastors.
Yeah.
Can you just say a little more about that?
Well, the leaders of the denomination, Ellen White and others, were speaking consistently against settling pastors in churches. And before the 20th century, we didn't have very many that had settled pastors. I think maybe Battle Creek did by that point, and maybe another big church or two, but it really wasn't the norm by any stretch. But really, in the wake of World War I, A.G. Daniels starts to really write against it, which shows that it's happening more frequently, and it starts to spread through the 20th century. And so we started to settle pastors in churches because we wanted to be like other churches and have a pastor there. Prior to this time, Ellen White and others are saying, we don't want to have a minister settled in churches because we don't want anyone to do the thinking for the people. Same reason that they're rejecting having a church manual. They don't want to have anything other than scripture, helping to determine policies and so forth. And so all of these kinds of things are in the mix, but they're being thrown out. Now, I get it. Times are changing. People are moving. As you get bigger, you need to have more levels of organization to keep the machine working. So how could we have ever done it any different or better? Maybe, maybe not. It's a difficult question to say. But that settlement of pastors and churches probably, and this needs further research, it probably seriously, I suspect it seriously impacted the role of women, because you see prior to this time that there were some female pastors, and in the mid 20th century they get booted out by and large until really a new wave of the women's rights movement will take up in the 60s and 70s. And so there was a period, a dip in time where women experienced a sort of putting out. There's an article I have written in Spectrum. It's called God's Last Choice. It's a 2-part article. It's 50 pages long. It's kind of long, but if you want to know more about some of the shifts and so forth going on at this time, you can check that out.
What was the title again?
The title is God's Last Choice, something like Overcoming Gender and Women in Ministry During the Fundamentalist Era. I don't know, something like that.
No, that's enough. Yeah. But one of the factors you were highlighting, and I somehow lost the meeting connection and had to come back, was because of the suspicion regarding Adventists not being true blue American.
Yeah. Right. I suspect that this is one of the factors that is at role in trying to help make Adventism look respectable. I think that's pretty clear from the context. And so, yeah, settling pastors in churches is one of the ways that we're trying to prove that we're not some crazy cult, that we're loyal, respectable Americans, just like all the other Christians in the country. And so, yeah, having a settled pastor is a key thing there. And you need that to check any kind of fanaticism or sensationalism, right? I mean, how many times have we heard some local elder or deacon or some other person get up and preach some real crazy sermon? I mean, so the local pastor can play a pretty significant role. And I'm not disparaging that. Like, I think when it's working right, it's working right, Of course, local pastors have also been known, but not generally speaking, wreak havoc, right? So
yes,
we're human. Anything we do, anything we try will be imperfect, and it will have strengths and weaknesses. So,
and I love that point you've made, because it seems to me that we need to say we've made a mistake and that God is gracious to us in spite of us.
I think so.
Of what we've done, and can redeem situations, instead of claiming, like our pioneers did, that God wanted us misled and to not understand prophecy.
Right. Or instead of blaming it on the Jesuits, admit that we make the mistakes, not the Jesuits or some other outside person, right?
Thank you so much.
Yep. You're welcome.
All right. Thank you so much, Carmen. Emmanuel, it is time for you to now join the conversation.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I enjoyed the presentation, and your presentation was so good, it created 2 disturbing questions in my mind.
Okay.
The first one, after they change the title of the chapter, after they reinterpret, the question is, the church in North America is a creation of the New Testament or a creation of the state? Question number 2.
Okay.
If they change the title of the chapter and the theology, the question is to what extent the theology was accurate if we have to change it?
Yeah, those are good questions. These are very good questions. Well, first of all, keep in mind that the changes are subtle. But to say that, like, to shift from saying that America is currently the beast now to saying that it will become a beast at some future point, that's a subtle shift. But that's an important shift in the eyes of the government, right? Because then you're able to say, I'm not against what you're doing now. I see no problem with what you're doing now. Let's move on. Let's work together. And so that can easily help the church to embrace things, socially speaking, that we had rejected before. So I do think it's a factor that helps make racism a structural part of the church. I do think it plays a role to some degree in us adopting more conservative gender norms. Well, we were saying before that a woman can preach and prophesy and teach and have authority over men unanimously, basically, before this time. And then you'll see at this time, Adventists publishing articles that saying Paul says stay silent, so women must be silent in the church. So like all these kinds of things are happening. Now, you can't blame all this on the government, but the government is playing a role, and how far and wide that role goes, we don't know until we have properly studied it thoroughly. We have not done that yet. So please keep in mind that what I'm saying is sort of on a theoretical basis. But again, when it comes to changing theology, something that you have to understand about human beings. I'm a historian, so this is just run-of-the-mill, standard, non-controversial, just benign kind of thought, but it might strike you as shocking. But human beings, naturally, because of the God-given gifts that we have, we invent, we create, we reinterpret, we redo, we change. That is what we do day after day after day. As generation after generation comes and goes, that is what happens. And so theology has changed so much over time. It has changed for 2,000 years. Like, we believe things very different than the early Christian church did on many, many, many points. There are some that we generally find some agreement, but even things like maybe the Trinity, like, we will define them differently. And so, like, if you get down to the nitty-gritty, we're very different. And this is the way it goes. And this is what I like to tell my students. This is a healthy reminder that we are not saved by our theology. And one of the things that I take comfort in this is, think about it. I've studied theology. I've got my master's degree in it. I've done a PhD just about in religion. And I know that understanding theology correctly, if we want to put that in scare quotes, that takes a lot of work. And thank God we're not saved by our works. We're saved by a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. We're saved by Christ. And that is what matters. And theology is there to serve, to guide us on a relationship with Christ so that we can try to have the closest relationship and most meaningful relationship that is possible while we are on this earth, like while time lasts, or while we are in our little 80 years, 40, whatever years we've got, while we're here on terra firma, traversing this space before we shuffle off this mortal coil. That is why we have theology. It helps guide us into a real meaningful relationship with God. And so it would be better, I think, if we could be more understanding and stop trying to be so critical and pointing our fingers at people who we think are unorthodox. I think another point that I should make here is that when you look at the Bible, what does the Bible stress? Does the Bible stress orthodoxy or orthopraxy? My reading of Scripture shows that the Bible cares a lot more about what we do and how we treat people than it does about what we think. And that is what I think really, really matters. Christ makes it so clear when he says, whatever you have done to the least of these, you have done unto me, right? And so, and then of course, the converse of that, which he also says, whatever you have not done to the least of these, you have not done unto me. And so it's about what we do. Are we loving people? Are we living that life of love? And that's what we've got to do. And theology is important because it should help guide us in our understanding of that, but it's not the sum total. And I think it's not the most important thing about our faith. I think what we do and how we behave is far more important than our theology, but that's just me.
All right, thank you so much for the question, Emmanuel, and thanks, Kevin, for that response. Randy. over to you. Please join the conversation.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. What a fascinating topic you have brought to us today. And perspective. So we've talked through and kind of into the early 20s and maybe even pushing into the mid 30s of North America and what's going on. In those years from, let's say, the early 1920s all the way up to the U.S. entry into World War II, besides the materials changes to placate authorities and stuff, what did those things organizationally, I mean, you've talked about the church structural changes, but organizationally, what things grew inside the church? What practices did we bring inside the church doors to demonstrate our patriotic fervor and our willingness to join with the state, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, if I'm taking the question correctly, there were changes. One of them, which you may have been hinting at directly, is bringing in the American flag. So
just one of them, yeah.
That's just one of them, right? So the American flag was not in our churches by and large. Now, it looks like from what I've read that among the evangelical churches in the wake of World War I, like during World War I and in the wake of that, that's when most evangelical churches started to put the American flag in their churches. Now, during the Civil War, you had Jan Loughborough holding Adventist tent meetings and so forth, and he did fly the American flag above the tent. But that's a bit different than bringing a flag inside the church doors. And from what I've seen, and this is only a study of published accounts, we weren't doing this until the wake of World War II. So we delay a little bit longer than the evangelicals, but you start to see report after report after report during World War II and in the wake, especially during the Cold War period, where there are major pomp and circumstance ceremonies where they bring in the flag and march it in, in these kinds of ways as a display of their faithfulness to the nation. And so, yeah, that's one of the things that has come into the church. Now, if there's another thing you're hinting at, like another sort of artifact kind of things being brought into the church, I'd love to know what you had in mind. The flag is the most overt example I can think of.
I mean, not just artifacts, but I mean, we look at pathfinding, and pathfinding is a quasi-military. I'm sorry, it's quasi-military. No matter how you want to slice the cake, we march around, we do all that kind of stuff, and I have no necessarily problem with it. It just seems to me be another artifact. Things that are brought in.
Oh, definitely. And I loved Pathfinders. I see one of my childhood friends here, Gavin Lowry. It's good to see him. And when my parents were in charge of like the Adventures Club, I'm sure Gavin and I were in it together. I loved it because we did camping, we made crafts and did all sorts of stuff. And I moved to the area around Ozark Adventist Academy and I joined Pathfinders, and I absolutely hated it. And I quit very quickly because all we did day in and day out was drilling and marching, drilling and marching, drilling and marching. And our leader was so militaristic that he insisted that his wife and child call him captain. You don't call him by the first name. It was all captain, my captain. Oh, I hated it. So my experience with Pathfinders was tainted. Now I would be very happy for my children who are 5 and 3 to go through and have their own journey. I have enough faith that like the local chapter here of Pathfinders here at Andrews University could be fun and balanced enough. But yeah, it still is very, and especially it can be in certain regions, very militaristic. And that's just another way that yes, but there's probably many. If we started to unpack all the different ways that Adventism sort of has demonstrated or shown its patriotism or sort of modeled things after the government, we could probably find many more examples. So that was another good one. Thanks for that, Randy. I appreciate it.
All right, thanks, Randy. Ed, it is time for you to join the conversation.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for a stimulating presentation. And you did it all from memory, too. When those cases in World War I, where the Adventist Church was being investigated, and they came up with things that they felt were suspicious or might be a concern. How many of those things were around prophetic interpretations?
Yeah.
And prophetic interpretations that might have raised seditious suspicions, as opposed to, say, the way we did business or how we operated church or what we believed, other than prophetic interpretations. So how big a role did that play in what people became concerned about in their investigations?
Yeah, great question. The prophecy stuff was a big part of it. But there are so many big parts of it that it's really hard to see or say what was dominant. It really kind of depended upon the person who was observing whatever they found to be un-American. So, I mean, there really are several big things. The understanding of prophecy, two-horned beast, and premillennialism more broadly. That's a factor. You have the non-combatant stuff, as I said. That's a big factor, especially for schools, because that's where they have the young people, right? So that was probably more important for school communities than it was for the publishing houses. And then there's also the fact that, like, the German sector of the church is the largest sector. We have missionaries going in and out. There are people trying to leave the country, and missionaries and so forth that are being detained. Like C.C. Chrysler, for example, has some of his correspondence confiscated by the government and so forth, because he's out, and is he still out in China by that point? I don't know. So there's lots of things that are going on, and it's difficult to say what is more important. But let's not forget the labor union stuff, because they're convinced that we're socialists by and large, and so that's a big part of it. There's a lot of language about socialist material, and so I don't know if we can quantify it, say what is more important or what is not. What I see is sort of a kaleidoscope, a network, an intertwisted mess of issues that are all involved, and we need to see the whole package. And so we can't take any one of these aspects away. They're all playing a significant role. One issue, though, that is not on the minds of people is the Sabbath. We fear this national Sunday law, and this is still in an early period where we're concerned about people worried about us keeping the Seventh-day Sabbath. That's not an issue. The only time Sabbath observance will be an issue between us and the state is if our Sabbath observance somehow infringes upon our so-called duty to the state. So if we're not willing to bear arms on Sabbath, or if there's mandatory work, if there was ever a law of mandatory work on Saturday, that would get us in trouble with the government, but not just because we worship on Sabbath alone. Like, there's got to be some other aspect that would be added to that would make it offensive and make us look like we're disloyal in some way. And so, yeah, national Sunday law, if we limit our understanding of America becoming a beastly power to that, we are wrong. We're missing the boat. And Ellen White, by the way, never said that there was only going to be one issue. She consistently pointed out from the very beginning of her ministry to the end that Adventists will be duty bound to break laws, in the plural, at the end of time. And the very first law, by the way, that she ever tells Adventists to break was the fugitive slave law, a law that was racist. And she didn't even talk about the Sabbath that much during that time. And so the very first law, when she brings up this idea of breaking laws at the end of time, it was a law that was racist. And so we need to be open to thinking about laws, maybe the banning of certain kinds of history, the certain kinds of books, other kinds of things as playing roles, if we really want to stay true to seeing how things are going to play out. Yeah, good question.
All right, thanks, Ed, and thanks for that response, Kevin. Bob Johnston, please.
I have a question, Kevin, and by the way, it was an outstanding presentation. I hope that all gets into a book sometime. I have a question and then an observation. The question is this: the church had become established in some countries where an anti-American doctrine would have been welcome.
Yeah.
Did our evangelists in such countries exploit it? I'm thinking of countries like Argentina and, of course, Germany. That's the question. My observation is that our evangelistic preaching and even our our doctrinal statements in the early days, the latter part of the 19th centuries, clustered around prophetic interpretation. That was what we considered to be present truth. And that's a very risky theological strategy to adopt because events can falsify it. We just now celebrated the 70th year of Israel, the state of Israel existence. When I was young, I remember passing out tracts saying that such a thing would never happen because it was contrary to prophecy. And Turkey was another big part of our kerygma. And Turkey is still an important country, but not the way we presented it. And we could make a whole list of prophetic interpretations, which have frankly been falsified by events.
Absolutely.
I don't know if you want to make any comments about that.
Well, I do agree with you. I mean, when we began, prophetic interpretation was really the bread and butter of Adventism. And it is risky. You're right. It's risky because of the fact of falsifications, but I'll also add, which I think you've gotten a glimpse and taste of, it's risky too, because if you really put a lot of your vision through Revelation 13, for example, you can be very critical of the government, and that'll get you into trouble. And so that is a significant factor. Now, you asked about whether or not Adventists who entered into some places like Argentina or maybe Germany. Argentina, of course, who had a lot of ties with Germany during the World War II era. Well, actually, even between the wars. I would imagine that there was that some of the Adventist teachings against America did become useful. I don't have any direct evidence of that, but it would be my guess that is true. I do know that we've had several missionaries that have been radical in their critiques of the government, and so in Peru, for example, the Stalls were quite radical and taught the locals there, who were by and large enslaved by the Catholic landowners. They taught them to read and how to write petitions and how to resist the oppression and to ultimately break free from their slavery there in Peru. And so there are some encouraging stories like that, but it's not necessarily tied with anti-American teachings. So all of that is to say, Bob, I don't really have a good answer to your question, but I suspect you're asking the right question.
Okay, thank you so much, Bob. Thanks, Kevin. Gavin, it is now time for you to unmute and join the conversation.
All right, thank you. Kevin, I'm just gonna say hi.
Hi.
It's good to see you again. This speech has been absolutely mind-blowing to me, especially being someone that's been very much interested in history, having taught history to my own students, and honestly, I don't even know what to ask at this point because a lot of people already asked the questions that I had. But honestly, it just astounds me just how those slight little changes have just progressed. And it's like I don't even know where to go at this point because, like I said, everyone's basically asked the questions I had.
Sure.
But honestly, at this point, it's mainly thank you for digging this up, because this is beyond fascinating and beyond enlightening on how just the Adventist culture has changed just from one little incident or such a big incident, honestly. So
thanks, Gavin. I appreciate that. I would never want to put everything on hinging upon this one issue. I would never want to do that. That's too simplistic, but it is a big role. And I think that we're alarmed by the fact that the state impacted us in that kind of a way. And it is alarming. And it's a thing that I personally I wrestle with. I think like all of us do. It's like, what do we do with this? This is not what I expected. But one thing that could help, for better or for worse, is to try to say what would happen if we were in their shoes, if we faced 20 years in federal prison, or slightly changing some of the things that we printed. And it did get to the point where we literally were saying to the government, like, okay, we want to print this article, can we do so, yay or nay? And they will say yay or nay. And so that is alarming. Yeah, it's alarming. But part of one of the reasons that we failed so poorly, I think, is because we have neglected, to our detriment, to teach or have Adventist perspectives on social and political issues, I think. And so one of the biggest changes that you see is all of a sudden Adventists get super patriotic.
Yeah.
And so they're really, pushing patriotism in their papers and so forth and all of that kind of thing. And is that a shift? Well, yes, it is. But is it a bad shift or is it a good shift? I mean, it depends on your perspective. I think there's a real danger if we emphasize patriotism too much, because think about what has happened. We've talked about World War II a few times in this conversation. No one has ever written about World War II as a civil war for Adventists. But it was. Because you had Adventists on both sides of armies fighting and killing one another. Now, they're not necessarily doing so because they know they're killing other Adventists. They probably would be opposed to that. But in a global setting, a world war like this puts us at war with ourselves, whether we want to like it, whether we like it or not. And there is one very touching historical fact that illustrates this. And this is the story of Paul Tatsuguchi. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of Paul Tatsuguchi before. Paul Tatsuguchi was a Seventh-day Adventist who was Japanese, and he comes to the United States and studies at Pacific Union College for 4 years, and then does 4 years at Loma Linda. And he becomes a doctor. And he goes back to Japan and is working as a doctor before the Second World War breaks out. And he is drafted or conscripted into the military, and he serves the Japanese Empire. And he is part of a force that actually invaded Alaska, which was not part of the United States yet, but there is only one actual pitched battle that was fought, aside from like Pearl Harbor, on what would become U.S. soil. And this is the Battle of Attu, I think is what it was called. And Paul Tatsuguchi was there. And from his diary that he kept, it was very clear that he was pro-Japan, pro-empire, pro-emperor, etc. And there was another doctor on the American forces who was also at that battle. And that battle ended with a total annihilation of Japanese forces. Those who died in battle, the others who survived who didn't die in battle committed suicide, including Paul Tatsuguchi. Paul Tatsuguchi committed suicide. And as the American forces are rummaging through all of the baggage in the camp of the Japanese, etc., one of them comes up with a Gray's Anatomy textbook. And inside the cover, it had Paul Tatsuguchi's name. And they bring this Gray's Anatomy textbook to this American doctor, and he's shocked because he had been at PUC for 4 years with Paul Tatsuguchi. And then at 4 years at Loma Linda, they were friends, and he had no idea that his army played a role in killing his own friend. And so this is what happens. And so what are we supposed to do in World War? It's a very difficult question, and I can't give all the answers in there. We need to have more voices, of course, but like something to think about is if we stress patriotism too much to where we put a love of country before or on par with our love for God, then we will do just about anything, right, to protect the state. And that is dangerous as well. And so there's a lot of complexities here, a lot of problems that can arise. Can we blame our pioneer, the people who were there in the 19 teens for what they did? I'm not sure, but there's good and bad and ugly. And I'll just say, I'll end it without an answer. I'm conflicted with it all. So I think that perhaps you all are as well. And that's probably okay. It just gives us things to think about as we try to navigate our own lives. So.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Kevin. And it does get me thinking and wondering if, that kind of an approach of subtle shifts could happen again.
Oh, it does all the time.
and
that's the standard. Things change all the time. This is just what happens every day. So it's just we're alarmed because the state played a role this time, right? So
yeah. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Linda, please join the conversation.
Thank you so much. Kevin, what you may or may not know is that the unstated measure of the success of a presenter during these meetings is the relative level of activity in the chat during the presentation. And I think many of us wondered if our internet connections were solid because of the absence of activity. So my friend, you hit a home run. Just want you to know that.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
And my question, actually, it's like a little three-part question. It's very brief, and it doesn't really contribute anything to the presentation itself. More a matter of curiosity on my own part. But I read recently that William Miller was a Mason, and you're nodding. So and I know that he died in the late 1840s. But I also read that there were other members of the early Adventist Church that perhaps had been Masons. And if that, I wonder if you know if that is true, and if it were, I wonder if that extended on beyond those early days to the point where that might have contributed in some way to the level of surveillance at the time that a period that you described during World War I.
Great question. So nothing about Masonry and Adventism cropped up in the FBI files I looked at, but there is a story to be told about Adventism and Masonry. William Miller was a Freemason for many years, but then he canceled his membership in 1833, I think is the year. It's 32, 33. And he's doing so at a time when anti-Masonry is starting to rise up really in significant force for the first time. There was a man named William Morgan who had been a Mason and then defected and was broadcasting that he was going to publish all of their secrets, and then he disappears. And people suspected he was murdered, right? And so, because he was never seen from again, and he probably was murdered. And so because of that, like anti-Masonry started to sweep the nation. And so William Miller cancels his membership in the wake of that. And so you had many other Millerites who had been Masons, and they do the same. And by and large, beginning with the Millerite movement on through the 19th century, at least, you have Adventists that are by and large anti-Masonry. And so they're anti-free, secret societies and so forth because of these kinds of, they view them as oppressive, right? Where you could get murdered or something like that. Now, that doesn't mean that there were not Adventists who were Masons, and there were some. So I think Alexander Ross is the name, is the man who was a Mason, and you can go to his tombstone. He was an Adventist, and you can see a Mason sign on his tombstone. So he clearly was a Mason his entire life as an Adventist. And so there were some that were out there, but they were really, I would say, fringe. They weren't, or at least they were few and far between. Alexander Ross wasn't exactly fringe, but he was not, his views on this were not widely supported. And so really the bulk of Adventism was against Freemasonry. So yeah, I don't see that as being a factor in any way to the issues of surveillance. In fact, I'm quite certain it's not.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right, thank you for that, Linda. Lauren, it is just after 3:30 when we would usually have our closing prayer. So I'm going to ask you to do that for us before you ask your next question.
Thank you. Thank you, Terry Ann. Kevin, you're really twisting my mind here. I'm having to question some of the assumptions I had about the changes in the church over the years, and I'm really looking forward to the book that's going to come out of this. Let me just mention here, since we're at 3:30, now we'll keep talking because I know there's going to be a few more hands that'll pop up here, and already we have Andreas. Oh, what happened to your hand, Andreas Bachman? We need you. Let me just mention, I try in our Adventist Day Sabbath seminar to kind of have a balance over the course of the month, and I always like to try to have at least one class that's biblical exegesis, and that's going to be next week. That is going to be our friend who has taught for us quite often, Matilda Fry from Walla Walla University. She always does a really great job of unpacking an Old Testament passage for us, but I'm embarrassed to say I haven't asked her yet what she's going to do. So I will get that out this week. Dr. Fry is a really good Bible teacher. So that's looking forward to next week. And then on the 27th, we're going to have Laura Wibberding from Pacific Union College. Laura always does something that is kind of a combination of sociology and church history, and is a really good teacher. Just so clear and step by step. I really enjoy the teaching of both of these women that we have coming up. So I'm pretty proud of having them address our classes. So be ready for that. Now let me mention one more thing before you go. Before I ask my question, I do have a question here. And that is, any of you who want to get on the mailing list to be reminded when the Adventist Day Sabbath Seminar is and what's coming up, send me your email addresses right here. Also, we're very open to just sending you our quarterly magazine. You just give me, if you're in the United States, we have a little more trouble sending it overseas unless you've been a pretty big donor. I hate to say it that way, but it's true. It's expensive to do that. We have a person who has to do that for us. We have to pay quite a bit to send things overseas. But if you're in the United States, I can just put you on the mailing list. So in the chat, if you want to be on the email list or you want to get the magazine and you're not getting it, send me a little note here and I'll make note of those. Okay, so then let me have a prayer for us, and then we'll continue with a little bit of our conversation, Kevin. God, Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you and praise you for the church that has nurtured us and raised us. We want to be grateful for it. We're sometimes disturbed by what we learned, but Lord, I learned about Jesus here, and a lot of the rest of us did too. We pray that you will continue to bless the ministry of Kevin Burton and help him over the next few months as he submits his dissertation, and help each of us, Lord. Let us be thoughtful, let us be kind, let us be open to others who are unlike us. I pray in the name of Jesus, amen.
Amen.
Yeah, Kevin, my question is kind of unfair to you, I think.
Fair.
I don't know quite, historians, the historians I've known are a strange breed, Kevin. They evaluate the past, but sometimes we ask them to then extrapolate in the future. But there's a line that about history repeats itself. And then I read the other day, somebody says, no, history doesn't repeat itself, but historians repeat one another. I thought that was pretty cute.
Too often, yeah.
Yeah. But really, I'm really intrigued by a little bit of your sort of psychosocial analysis of us when you say, which I guess we know, but we don't always know how it worked. When you say, we always change.
Yeah,
we
okay.
always change to meet the culture that we're in.
Yeah.
I put up a piece yesterday by one of the people who's here on the list, who's been listening in Thundazani Valanga. He said, he says the same thing about our biblical interpretation. He said, like it or not, we're going to interpret the Bible according to what's going on around us.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely true. So I guess one of the question that I want to ask is, as you look at our church today, in light of here in the United States at least, in light of so many of my friends who have signed on to the evangelical right wing so strongly, I keep following Ted Wilson, who is really an effective communicator and propagandist for the church. I think he's unusually good. Not that I agree with him, but I think he's been good at putting forth. What do you see as you look at our church and what it's communicating through its official channels and other things? How are we at this point reflecting the culture?
Ooh,
that's a hard one, isn't it?
That's very hard. Yeah, that's very hard. That's not, historians aren't good at the present, right?
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I've had other historian friends tell me, no, don't ask me what's going to happen. I'll just tell you what did happen.
That's our cop out. I mean, I live in this world and I have opinions about the present. And to be honest, one of the biggest, and this is because of my own interest too, I'm biased by what I study, and I study a lot with our history that deals with race issues. And so one of the biggest laments I have is that by and large, the Adventist Church, at least at the top level, I think the NAD is to some degree excluded from this.
Agreed.
We basically have adopted this idea that we must stay silent on political issues. And the political card is usually thrown when it becomes an issue of something like race, because let's be frank, we are very political as a church. We are lobbying in Congress. We just had Adventists in the Supreme Court in this country, lobbying for things. We are always, like, we have a religious liberty association. Like, we are very political, but we've chosen what kind of politics we want to be involved in. I mean, we could talk about temperance, prohibition, anti-cigarettes, whatever, anti-tobacco. So, like, we've always been political, and we are very political, but we're a certain kind of political. Mm-hmm. And what is disturbing to me is that I have learned, I grew up in a very conservative culture. I did not realize that I was racist whenever I grew up and so forth. And I've grown out of a lot of different things. And so I learned a lot and was very shocked by what I found about our pioneers, because I did not expect to see people like Joseph Bates circulating petitions to legalize interracial marriage. And so that kind of stuff shocked me. And I started asking questions about myself, and I started to see that one thing is certain of our pioneers: they were anything but silent when it came to race issues. And I am deeply troubled at the fact that the General Conference seems to have this idea that we must continue this sort of policy of neutrality or silence to this day. And that is, I think, dare I say it? I'm going to say it. Heresy. I think that is unbiblical, and I think it is wrong, because there is nothing worse than to say that someone made in the image of God is not equal to somebody else made in the image of God. And that's what racism does. Racism is attacking the very character of God himself, because we are all created in his image. And I am utterly repulsed when we take a standard approach of neutrality on these issues. And that is a way I think that we are, as a worldwide denomination, moving with a particular kind of culture. I do believe that silence is complicity. And I do want to add, I think silence is sin.
Yeah.
And so I think that is one of the big ways. Now, there are probably many others.
Yeah, this reminds me of something that's been very upsetting to the whole Adventist community, and that is that the church in Uganda came out in support of the death penalty and life imprisonment for gay people, and the General Conference remained decidedly silent. They say nothing.
Absolutely.
And this is heartbreaking to me. I mean, even though there is a BRI paper saying that we should not come out in support of the death penalty, there has been no word about it. Deadly silent. This has bothered me, Kevin, probably more than anything that I have ever encountered in my church, that nobody can say a word against this.
Yep. I have been told to be silent many times, and I refuse. I refuse. When it comes to issues like this, which are clearly in the right, I mean, come on, no matter what perspective you have on LGBTQ issues, you ought to know that killing someone over this is not the right answer.
Exactly.
And we need to be at a place, I think, where we as a church can apologize for the wrongs that we've done to all people who have been oppressed, regardless of whether or not we agree with them or not. It doesn't matter. They're people. Why have we ever gotten to the place where we think that it's okay to insult or physically harass and harm other people? It is beyond. I share your lament. It breaks my heart to put it.
I understand. I can kind of look back at the racial thing of Jim Crow and all of that, and I said, well, at least we moved past that. Right now, we are straight in the middle of this Uganda thing, and there's an amazing New York Times article where it talked about young people, young trans and gay people fleeing to Kenya and saying, people are telling us they're hunting us, they want to slaughter us.
Oh, sure.
We deserve to be slaughtered. And my church took a stand in favor of that.
Yeah.
This bothers me more than anything that I can possibly say.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kevin. We got to have some time here for Andreas and Patty to join us. Sorry, I talked so long.
All right, thanks, Lauren. Andreas, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Thank you. Well, I'm with you on that one, Lauren. I want to be counted as one who is utterly disgusted by what is going on from our church leadership in regards to Uganda, and perhaps my witness, my little testimony, is as a German. Patriotism is not in my vocabulary. And if you think of being a German with a German history, whether East Germany or the Nazi time, doesn't really matter. Patriotism can never be the answer. And I'm surprised that it is so difficult in other cultures and nationalities to see that. We are citizens of the kingdom of God, end of story. And we are a global church, and we rejoice over that. My question, however, is a historical one in regards to your topic, Kevin, and that is during World War I, the German Adventist Church has indeed been very nationalistic and pro-warfare. And I was intrigued that the Germans in America were so pacifistic, as it seems, and rejected war and going to the army, and were quite radical about it. And as you obviously will know, the German church split over the issue at that time. So I'm just wondering, I'm just curious whether the FBI or the BI was making that connection at all, or whether just focused on Germans in America, because they talked about spies and all that.
Yeah.
Just curious. Thanks.
That's a great question. I did not and have not seen anything in the files that I have seen about noticing the split or the German side of the question. What really would be fascinating is to go into the government archives of Germany and investigate what they were saying, because I'm sure that we were under investigation there to some degree during World War I as well. I would love to do that. I unfortunately don't read German. One of my colleagues, Dennis Kaiser, has wanted to do this and work on this with me, but we haven't had the time thus far. But as far as what I've seen in the FBI files, they're mostly concerned about the people that they encounter in the United States, as well as people that actually are trying to enter into the United States. And one of the tragedies is that I'm sure that there are many files that I have not been able to find, but they're very hard to locate, because these documents were photographed with like a 19-teens camera, and then those photographs they were first of all typed on a typewriter, and then the documents were photographed with a 19-teens camera, and then those photographs were scanned. And so the OCR, the text recognition, is so bad that, like, if you were to search for the word Adventist, you only get like 32 hits in the database I used. But some of these documents, like the word Adventist, appears like 20 times, but it only showed up one time when you search for it. So there are many files that I think may never be found, because there are so many millions of pages of files at this time. You'd have to go through and read all of them, and that's pretty much impossible to do. So anyhow, there could be something out there, but I highly doubt it, that deals with that side of the question that you've raised. It's mostly people that are in the United States that are being targeted and the issues being discussed. I've never seen anything like that about the German split being raised. So good question.
Okay, thanks, Andreas. Patty, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Hi, thank you. This is just really fascinating. And my comment has to do with throwing out something else that was going on in the culture and in the church around the time in the 20s and that I happened upon recently. And when Carmen was talking about the women and the time when women were starting to be shunted aside, and the theme that we've been talking about today, that we always change with the culture. Okay, here's what I found. And this blew my mind too. I happened across a copy of a book titled 1922. And you may be familiar with it. I'm sorry, I do not own the book. I don't have it. And I can't remember the name of the author, but it looked like a dissertation from somewhere. But I was reading through this, and there was information in there that was just like crazy. But the culture apparently at a certain point had decided that men were getting too effeminate and they needed to get stronger and more affirmative, more. Yeah. So they started to look around for a role model of a person who could role model that to the culture. And they happened upon Teddy Roosevelt, bully, the little guy who was, who exemplified all these characteristics that they thought men were lacking in. And so they had some campaign to have men start being more like Teddy Roosevelt. And this flooded over into the church as well. And this was all about the same time that the men started stepping up, taking their positions back, sending their wives back home, not allowing them to work. And I wondered if that was anything that you had ever run across in your research. It was just, yeah.
Yeah, you're talking about the rise of what scholars called muscular Christianity. And that is really kind of picking up in the late 19th and then especially early 20th century. And it is very impactful. And it's not just impacting the kind of heroes you idolize, but it impacts the way people view Jesus and how Jesus is depicted and drawn and so forth. And sort of the carpenter, muscular Christ is rising up to this idea that, and this impacts men can't cry, men can't look wimpy or weak. All of this is there. And it's terrible. Like so many aspects of this is really toxic in my opinion. But yeah, it definitely, Michael Campbell is the one who wrote the book you're talking about. And he shows some highlights there in that book of how that impacted Adventism. And it most certainly did. It most certainly did. And this is going to, it's impacting everyone in America. And so we're no different. And so we are impacted by the rise of muscular Christianity like everybody else. This is just, I hope, this is just normal. Like I keep saying, like, this is just what happens. Like, we don't live in a vacuum. We are always influenced by the culture that we live in. And I should say cultures, because culture is not a solitary, cleaned category. Like it's a very diverse kind of thing. There are different kinds of cultures and so forth. So we have options out there, and we need to try to be careful to align with the right kinds of ideologies and right kinds of cultures and so forth.
All right. Thank you so much, Patty. I think we may have time for maybe one more question. And just to let you know, Patty, there's another book that deals with that issue, Jesus and John Wayne.
Yep.
That I think excellently treats with that subject as well. But Ayando, welcome back to the conversation. Please go ahead.
Thank you. It's just a follow-up question, just out of curiosity. What do you think the Branch Davidians and all that movement in the whatever the cops did to those people actually did for the church? Although, yes, we do admit they were not Adventists, but the leader, excuse me, he had some Adventist leanings at the start and so forth. So, what do you think, as a historian, looking at that movement and how it ended? How did it impact the church? Can we expect, looking at how the rhetoric of the day is becoming, is there a possibility of another movement like that even coming up again?
Oh, sure. Great question. I think it's always possible for movements like that to rise up out of any religion, including Adventism, especially religions that are apocalyptic in their focus. The David Koresh Branch Davidian catastrophe of 1993 was very, very impactful on Adventism, by and large because the Davidians claim to be rightful heirs of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, even to this day. So how many of you have been to Waco and seen the Davidian compound? Well, if you go there today, if you haven't been there, you'll see on the wall, they've got a big picture of William Miller, a big picture of Ellen White, and then David Koresh, and then also Trump flags everywhere, by the way. So they give out free The Great Controversy, and Remnant Publications keeps them stocked with stuff that they give out to people as they come. They have tourists that come every day to the Branch Davidian compound. So even to this day, people are getting the idea that the Branch Davidians are Seventh-day Adventists. And so if we're not careful to help people understand who we really are, we will be lumped in, or we potentially could be lumped in with groups like that in the future, although they're pretty benign now. They're very small, and I don't think that we need to be concerned about any kind of a threat from the Branch Davidians. Most people, I think, recognize that the government really overstepped their bounds, and the actions that they took led to the death of dozens of people, including children. So we're living in a current climate, in a current era where I think most people, although I probably should just totally back up because there are many people who don't agree with this, but there's a lot of people who recognize that the government was at fault. But I think about the video game Far Cry 5 that came out while I was a student at Florida State University doing my PhD, and Far Cry 5 is a video game where you're literally going around and you're killing people in cults. It's a video game that, like, your job and agenda is to go around and murder and assassinate people in religious cults. And the video game writers admitted that they drew most of their inspiration from the People's Temple and sort of disaster with Mr. Jones, in Guyana, and then David Koresh. And I saw when I was very interested in this, I saw on one chat that one person wrote, "So the bad guys are Adventists?" Now that's accurate. And so that's terrifying, because there was at least one person running around playing a video game excited at the fact that they were killing Seventh-day Adventists. And by the way, since I'm a historian, I did preserve a copy of that so it wouldn't be lost. So I have that in my own personal archive. But that's a rare thing, right? I mean, but there are people out there, definitely people out there. I think they're mostly on the right, far right, that is, who really would love to see Adventists be a cult and lumped in with the Branch Davidians and not see us any different. And maybe they would want to, bar, banish, block, harass Adventism, make it illegal, whatever. That could come up at this stage. I could see it coming up from the far right, but not the left. The left is more about inclusivity. So anyhow, but the left has its problems too, as I've said.
Okay, all right, thank you. Dr. Johnston, you get the last question.
Well, it's kind of an observation, and I'd like to hear Kevin's reaction to it. I have said that it's risky to predict the future, but history has gone on long enough that we can see that in the history of religions, there are certain regularities. Yeah. Certain social developments produce certain theological developments. Adventists have been, through most of their history so far, an unenfranchised people with what I will call a minority complex, sometimes even a victim's complex.
Yeah.
And that is changing. We have the chaplain of the U.S. Senate, a presidential candidate. We've had congressmen, not only in the United States, but in Brazil and other countries where we have a sizable,
Jamaica.
In Jamaica, I think a head of state in Fiji, important chief justices in East Africa and so forth.
Papua New Guinea.
Yeah. It's pretty hard to be against the government when you're the government.
It's true.
So on the basis of what we know of these regularities in the history of religion, can you not make some predictions?
It's difficult, as you know. I think that as we move forward, Adventism will continue to adapt. And I think that that's going to look different in different places. So to be an Adventist in Jamaica is a whole different kind of experience where I think it's correct that Jamaica has the president and the
Governor General.
The Governor General and Prime Minister. Yeah.
And Prime Minister, thank you for getting the correct titles. They are Adventists. And so you have a totally different experience there than you would in the US, where we don't have that or anything close.
No, but we're heading that way.
Well, we are. Yeah, that's true. That's true. But we're still a minority, I guess. But yeah, so it is going to change us. It is going to impact us. And I would imagine that all can go well, but imagine what's going to happen when an Adventist in leadership makes a mistake that the majority of the people think is a problem. At that point, every kind of anti-Adventist propaganda that's been spread over the years is going to come out and bite us all in the backside. And that could go very wrong very quickly. Will that happen? Probably so. I mean, the closest thing we ever had to an Adventist president was not Ben Carson, but Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding was raised an Adventist, and he was elected president. Now, he happened to be loved and adored during his tenure, but shortly after he left office, the Teapot Dome scandal, got blown open, and people realized that there was all sorts of government mismanagement of funds, etc. And so he's considered one of the worst presidents in the world today. Well, he put some Adventist people in high offices back in his day, and he still had Adventist parents, and well, they were probably dead by that point, but like Adventist family members. And so it could have gone bad then, but it didn't, probably because he wasn't openly Adventist himself, probably was not Adventist in any way by that point. But in any case, if an open Adventist like a Ben Carson was to be elected and then something goes wrong, that's not going to look good for Adventism, and especially in the divided world that we live in. So if I was going to predict anything, I would say that if we have people in offices, and I'm not against it per se, but if it was to happen, and as it is happening, it could lead to major conflict, probably when, not even if, a major issue like I've described were to happen. Now, I'm not saying any of that like when just because of like an Adventist view. It's simply because of I understand how history works, and I know how that there have been people against Adventism for a long time. So
yeah, plus Kevin, something that we need to take into account is that Adventists have a tendency to rush into being persecuted.
That's true. Yeah, we'll grab any straw we can to prove that point.
We like the status of being the persecuted minority. Hey, we're going to have to bring this to an end, and I want to thank Cherry Ann and Kevin. This has been amazing. I want to talk to you some more.